know, the gravity is not just that apple falling from the tree, right? Great question from Siv about delivery and outer space. The things that I'm presenting, again, in You Can't Get to Mars Without Me, is again how we organize here in gravity and what we have to know about every aspect of movement. What is covered somewhat in the book, not in detail, this is going to be more in the course, is the actual, again, formation, but understanding the uterus environment versus out of the environment. You want to look at delivery, and I'm just going to put this on the background so you can start to see it. But when a child's going into delivery, right, they have to present. Now, I don't know if any of you realize this, but an astronaut doesn't urinate in outer space. They actually have to be programmed or told to. Now, it's believed that because the bladder is not having gravity, you don't have the force that you have to pee, and they have to cycle it out so, you know, you don't burst your bladder. I actually believe more so because when we're outer space, and again, this is presented in quite detail within the book, we're in this stage, the embryonic stage in a sense, because we're meant to expand in all directions. So neurologically, go back in what I call a womb-like behavior. So when we're going into now the delivery, and I'm going to replay this and go over it, but just to have it in the background, but when a baby is presenting, right, same thing, we're not eliminating. Right? And so we would have to eliminate, but there's a couple of things that go on here. So I don't believe right now, unless again, they set up a lot of equipment that I'm designing in outer space to do this. There's an active and passive phase that goes on in the mother's uterus, right? So the active muscles are contracting, right? But the passive muscles start going into the delivery process where the baby can rotate in its presentation, right? And then these contractions and the movements of the baby and that wanting to expand and that oppositional force. This is the first time they really get to feel it, right? So the oppositional force starts it, right? And that's what starts the mother's excitement for dilation. They lose the plug, and this is the first rotation you see from a human body, right? And so the body comes out, and then that's also what articulates the spinal column, because these bones, first the skull bones, facial bones, and then the spinal column get articulated into gravity. So and again, that it's not only that the baby is presenting out of the mother, the baby is presenting into gravity. And you see this with astronauts when they come back from outer space. This is a very quick video of an actual MRI of a child being born. I'm going to again play it. What I want you to pay attention to is the head. So in my paper, Infant Developmental Movement Patterns, right, one of the things that I talk about is the cavitation. So here's the baby presenting out. And what I talk about right here is cavitation, right? So that's a mucus plug actually starting to go, but cavitation. So what happens, cavitation is very similar to champagne. So when I pop a cork of champagne, so the bubbles aren't really in the champagne. It's the force that again opens up the nitrogen, oxygen, carbon. It's the same thing in the baby. The baby's lungs are filled with a foam. So I believe you're meant to have a natural childbirth, right? Right here is the force against the occiput, right, on the mother's pubic bone. But the parietal bones are actually your first developmental movement patterns, as the parietal bones literally pull you in, and that force of gravity. Natural childbirth is so essential to our lives. You just don't understand. C-section's there to save the mother and the child, but I can't even begin to tell you, though, that when you start having those kind of interruptions with natural movement, you have to go into, you have to offer these movements to the newborn in the neonatal period, really for optimal cognitive and alignment and neuromuscular. So you can see it here, almost like a mushroom shape. Well, if you look at a bottle of champagne, that cork almost does, that pressure is so great. But I also want you to visualize like a balloon going from a cold environment to a hot environment, right? That expansion mode, right? That expansion mode will put in velocity, momentum into that balloon, and it'll look like it's starting to travel, right? But that's also very similar what an astronaut does shooting across. They suddenly are using this embryonic stage of developmental movement patterns to propel themselves around the space station. And this is where the things that I'm talking about is, this might be fun and novel. We are really destroying the organizations of people's movements due to that. So this presentation is very important because it articulates, and I'm going to play this now again, it articulates right now the spinal column, right, to start it into movement. And it's very essential as that child comes out and prepares for delivery, right? And literally shoots out like a champagne cork, but that's the first rotation and the momentum that happens going into the childbirth. And so in outer space, what I believe what would happen, let's say if they didn't start to use some of my skills and what I'm trying to teach you here, and you're on the forefront of it all, is first of all, I think you'd have to have a C-section. If there wasn't any specific equipment put in there, there would be a C-section. But because there's no opposition in force here, but opposition in gravity is the key. And this is what you're reading in this book. That opposition in gravity just doesn't happen. The baby, in a sense, will actually float in space, I believe, similar to a water droplet. A water droplet doesn't create down. The buoyancy rate with the lack of opposition to gravity and going into that would really interfere. I really, without proper equipment and then, I wouldn't say therapy, but movement integration that needs to be done, that you find with my work, you couldn't reproduce in space. You might get away with it in gravitational fields, like in Mars. There's some gravitational pull in Mars, but it's still not the same because you have the rotation rate changes in Mars that you don't have on the Earth. See, again, not only are we organizing around the gravity, but that we organize around the rotation rate. We are Earth-based creatures for a reason, right? We've organized against Earth's rotation and we oppose that. And with our binding force within gravity, and that's what creates our organized structure of movement. So even in places like Mars, moon, I don't think you'd pull it off whatsoever because there's no rotation on the moon. Mars, like I said, with some equipment, you might get away with it, but to give birth to a baby, I think you really, like I said, first of all, you're probably looking at a C-section. And that's another complication, right? They have robotic systems up in space to do some basic surgeries, right? You actually can't go to outer space with molars, let's say, for an example, because they don't want them to erupt or anything like that. Any reason that you might have to have surgery, they try and take out of the system. And so that's what you're looking at with the birthing process. The complications of childbirth, like, that's another thing too. Americans are probably one of the worst for C-sections. We're one of the highest with the World Health Organization. World Health Organization standards wants to be about 10 to 15%. In some states, like in New Jersey, we're at about a 33% rate of C-sections. So the chance of needing a surgical birth in space, I think is going to be a no-go right off the bat. Of course, there's going to be someone that's going to want to experiment with the situation, or there's going to be an oops. And that's usually how most pregnancies start. They say we're planned, but we're not. And it's going to happen. And that's what is needed to be looked at. But again, within the book that you're reading, you're really on the forefront of understanding movement as a whole, including with the childbirth. And these are some serious questions, you know, even just to have intercourse in the space station. You're going to have some of the equipment that I kind of talk about. I mean, obviously I didn't give the designs away in the book. Because one of the things that does not happen in outer space is you lose your push-pull milestones. Right? Just what we take for granted of just opening up a door and letting that articulate against us. Those milestones are gone in outer space. So to have sex and so forth in outer space, it's just not going to happen without specific equipment. But these things are going to have to be discussed in a mature manner because, again, if we are looking to colonize, part of the key reason to colonize is to recreate human beings and to be looked at with that. But the fact that most humans, right, or professionals believe that if the child's brain is okay, the body is okay, versus that the movement dictates the cognitive formation. What I present here, a movement lesson, and then the book that you have, is just this new science, and it's not one to be taken lightly if we are going to stay in outer space. And that's why I just started presenting all this work because again, my work is mainly known for special needs kids, but everything that I've proven here is same. The organizations of movement or the the disconnect of the organization of movements that we need against Earth-based rotation is lost. And we can't just say, oops, and again, to create artificial gravity that they see it, that's not artificial gravity. And the same considerations are going to be having to take into consideration for childbirth. I hope that helps. Thanks.